Off the coast of Crete, where the water runs shallow and pale before the depth takes it, there is a particular quality of stillness that comes before a change in the sea. The color shifts first from the clear pale green of the shallows to something slightly darker, slightly denser, as though the water has become more aware of itself. The surface, which had been moving in small, unremarkable patterns, flattens, not all at once, but gradually, the way a conversation quiets when someone enters a room who was not expected. Then the light on the water behaves differently. The small bright points that travel across the surface, when a breeze moves through them, go still, and the sea becomes for a moment like polished stone, like a floor rather than a body of water, like something that could be crossed on foot if a person were willing to try. It was into that stillness, the oldest accounts of the story hold, that something began to rise. The disturbance came from below first, a change in the color of the water, at a point perhaps 30 feet from shore, the pale green deepening, darkening, becoming opaque in a way that the surrounding water was not. Then a movement beneath the surface that was not a wave and not a current, something with intention, something ascending with the slow deliberateness of a thing that has made a decision. The people assembled on the shore would have seen this before they saw anything else, a shape gathering itself beneath the surface, pressing upward, and the water above it beginning to lift. The bull came through the surface slowly. That is how the tradition holds it, not exploding upward in a spray of white water, but rising with a kind of heavy authority, as though the sea were releasing it gradually, reluctantly, as though the emergence had its own rhythm, and that rhythm belonged to something larger than either the creature or the water. The great white head appeared first, the broad forehead streaming with seawater that ran back over the flat surface of its face and between the horns in clear sheets. Then the shoulders, then the full width of the chest, water pouring from the white coat in long curtains that caught the morning light and scattered it into brief, fine fragments before falling back into the sea. Then the whole body, rising clear of the water, standing on legs that found the sandy bottom somewhere below the surface, and bearing the animal up into air. The assembled crowd on the shore went still. The tradition does not record how many were present, but Minos had arranged for witnesses. This was, after all, a demonstration, a proof intended for an audience, the kind of sign that derived its power from being seen. What they saw, those witnesses on the Cretan shore in the morning light, was a bull of such particular and concentrated whiteness that it seemed to carry its own light, or to be made of a different substance than the ordinary cattle that grazed the Cretan hills. Its coat was not merely pale, it was the white of something that had never been any other color, that had come from somewhere where color worked by different rules, where white meant not the absence of something, but the presence of everything held in perfect balance. Water still moved across its flanks as it walked from the sea. Its hooves found the wet sand. It walked toward land with no hesitation. Minos had prayed to Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of earthquakes, the deity who moved beneath the visible world, and could, if the occasion warranted it, allow extraordinary things to rise from his domain. The prayer had been specific and the terms had been clear. Minos was contesting the Cretan throne with his brothers, and the question before them was which of them the gods supported. He had asked for a sign from the sea. He had promised, in return for that sign, to sacrifice whatever Poseidon sent, to return the gift to the giver, which was the correct and expected form of the exchange between mortals and gods. A god sent something remarkable from his own realm. The mortal received it as evidence of divine favor. The mortal sacrificed it immediately, demonstrating that he understood the gift to be divine property on loan, not personal property freely given. That was the structure of the arrangement. Minos understood the structure. He had proposed it himself. The white bull walked out of the sea and across the wet sand and into the morning air of Crete, and the crowd that had been assembled to witness this demonstration understood immediately that the demonstration had worked. This was not a common bull. This was not an animal that could have arrived by ordinary means from ordinary water. The sea had produced it in response to a prayer, and the prayer had been Minos's, and the conclusion that followed from this was clear enough that no one present needed to state it aloud. The throne was Minos's. The gods had spoken through the form of a white animal standing on a Cretan shore, with water still running from its coat, and the matter was settled. What the tradition records next is the movement of the white bull from the shore into the interior of the island, was herded eventually into the royal pastures, where it moved among the ordinary cattle of the Cretan herds, and was immediately distinguishable from them by the quality of its coat. There is an image in this that is worth holding for a moment before moving on. The white bull in a broad Cretan meadow, the ordinary cattle of the herd, a range of ordinary colors around it, the bull itself moving through the grass with the same unhurried attention that cattle give to grazing, its head dipping and rising, its flanks still carrying some quality of the sea it had come from, its coat an entirely different register of white than the sky, than the limestone outcroppings at the edge of the field, than anything in the landscape around it. Minos stood among his herdsmen and looked at this animal. The oldest accounts do not record what he said or thought in those moments, and the tradition does not speculate. What it records instead is what he did, which was, after some period of considering the arrangement, to substitute a different animal for the sacrifice. The white bull was too beautiful to give back, too extraordinary, too valuable in the ordinary sense, as breeding stock, as the finest example of its kind that the island had ever seen or would likely see again. Whatever calculations Minos made in the privacy of his own reasoning, the outcome was that he selected another bull from his herds and sacrificed that animal to Poseidon, and the white bull, the one that had come from the sea, he kept. Ancient sources that preserve this story, the Bibliotheca attributed to Apollodorus, which was likely compiled in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, and the Bibliotheca Historica of Diodorus Siculus, written in the 1st century before it, are consistent on this point. The substitution is presented not as an ambiguous choice or a complicated decision, but as an act of impiety, a breach of the specific terms under which the divine gift had been extended. Poseidon had sent a bull from the sea in response to a particular promise. Minos had accepted the bull, accepted the throne that the bull's appearance had secured for him, and then had kept the animal for himself and sacrificed something of lesser value in its place. The gods, in the world these stories describe, were attentive to the terms of transactions. They noticed when the agreed exchange was not honored, and Poseidon, who had reached into the depths of his own domain to produce something of exceptional and specific beauty for the purposes of a mortal's political ambition, noticed the meadow where the white bull now grazed was broad and well watered, somewhere in the interior of Crete, and the bull moved through it with no awareness of what its continued existence in that field represented: a debt unpaid, an agreement broken, a god's gift retained past the point at which it should have been returned. It grazed, it was tended, it moved among the ordinary cattle and remained a different order of creature from them by virtue of its origin, even if no one looking at it from a sufficient distance would have been able to articulate precisely why. The quality of its whiteness, the particular way it carried its head, Something in the movement of its flanks that suggested its true nature had not been cancelled by its transition from the sea to the land, but only temporarily accommodated to a new environment. Poseidon's response, when it came, was directed not at Minos directly, but at someone much closer to him. This is the form the punishment takes in the tradition, not a god appearing before the king who wronged him and delivering judgment in plain terms, but an affliction that enters the royal house through an unexpected angle and unfolds with a slow, terrible logic of its own. The god's attention fell on Pasiphae, queen of Crete. She was the daughter of Helios, the sun god, who drove his chariot across the sky each day, and of the Oceanid Perse, which made her a figure of considerable divine inheritance on both sides. Her father was the sun itself. Her grandmother's family were the Oceanids, the daughters of the Titan Oceanus, who personified the great encircling river of water that the oldest Greek cosmology placed at the rim of the world. Pasiphae was, in other words, not an ordinary mortal woman. She was a figure of divine ancestry married into the royal house of a great Cretan king, and the affliction that Poseidon sent her was proportionate to the scale of the offense that had provoked it. The tradition, across all its surviving versions, is consistent on this point as well. What Pasiphae experienced was not of her own making. The desire that was sent to her was divinely imposed, a punishment enacted through her body, rather than directed at her soul or judgment. A god's revenge on a king worked through the person closest to him. Ancient sources treat this plainly. Apollodorus states it plainly. Daedalus states it plainly. The affliction was not a personal failing of Pasiphae's, and was not the result of any impiety on her own part. It was Poseidon's instrument, directed at Minos, finding its way through the most available and devastating channel. The tradition does not ask the listener to judge her for what the god sent. It records the fact and moves forward. What the tradition also records is that Pasiphae did not simply endure the affliction passively. She looked for a solution, the way people in the world of these stories frequently do when the gods present them with intractable situations, not by prayer alone, not by resignation, but by finding the most ingenious tool available and putting it to use. The most ingenious tool available at the Cretan court at that moment was Daedalus. Daedalus, whose name carries in it something like the quality of his reputation, a word close in meaning to cunningly wrought or finely made, was an Athenian craftsman, the finest of his generation, and he had come to Crete as an exile. The circumstances of his exile are part of the tradition that surrounds him and will be returned to later in this story. But what matters here is that he was at the Cretan court, he was indispensable to it, and he was the person Pasiphae approached. The tradition records that she told him what she needed. The tradition also records that he built it for her. The commission was extraordinary, even by the standards of a man whose ordinary work was extraordinary. What Pasiphae needed was a structure that could disguise her as something she was not, that could provide a form that the white bull in the meadow would approach without alarm. She needed, in other words, a piece of craft that would deceive an animal with senses far more acute than any human opponent, a deceiver that would have to hold up not to intellectual scrutiny, but to the close olfactory investigation of a creature that understood the world primarily through smell. This was not a commission that could be met with paint or with fabric alone. It required something more fundamental. It required Daedalus. What he built, according to the tradition, was a wooden framework, a structure in the shape of a cow, hollow enough to conceal a person within it, fitted beneath with small wheels so that it could be positioned and moved. Over the wooden frame he stretched real cowhide, treating the seams and joins with such care that the surface presented itself as continuous, as unbroken as the actual skin of the kind of animal it was representing. He worked on this in his workshop at the Cretan court, presumably by lamplight in the evenings when the court's other demands on his time had been discharged. The workshop of a craftsman of Daedalus's quality in the ancient world was not a disordered place. His tools would have been arranged. The materials for whatever current project occupied him would have been laid out in a sequence that made the progression of the work legible, each element ready for the moment the work required it. Wood for the frame, cowhide, whatever fixatives or treatments were needed to keep the hide pliable, to keep it from contracting or stiffening in ways that would compromise the illusion. Small wheels of some kind, set into the underside of the frame, on an axle or in brackets, low enough that the whole structure sat at the right height. Daedalus had built things far more complex than this. He had built things whose nature has not been fully described in any surviving account. But this commission had a specific requirement that distinguished it from most other work. It had to be invisible as craft. The whole point of the wooden cow was that it should not look like the work of a craftsman. It should look, to an animal with excellent senses and no reason for suspicion, like the kind of creature it was pretending to be. He worked on the hide with his hands. The oldest image here preserved in the way the tradition describes the project is of a man smoothing cowhide over a curved wooden surface in the lamplight of a workshop, pressing his palms along the grain of the material to find the joins, feeling for any place where the surface betrayed itself as assembled rather than whole, working the leather until the join became invisible under his hands. This was the standard of his work, not merely adequate, not approximately convincing, but actually invisible. The join that could not be found, the surface that refused to reveal its own construction. When the wooden cow was finished, it was taken on its wheels through the corridors of the palace complex, out through whatever gate gave onto the meadows, and positioned among the grass in the field where the white bull grazed. The positioning mattered. Daedalus would have understood this. The structure needed to be placed correctly relative to the bull's usual movement through the field, correctly relative to the wind direction, correctly relative to the distance at which the bull would first register the presence of something new in its environment and make a decision about whether to approach or avoid. The Cretan meadows in the late afternoon, in the long light of a late afternoon in the eastern Mediterranean, have a specific quality. The grass is short and often sparse on the limestone hillsides, longer and greener in the lower ground where water collects. The light at that hour is warm and slightly bronze-colored, slanting in from the west at a low angle that makes every object in the field cast a long shadow eastward. The cattle in the field, the ordinary cattle, the ones that had grazed there since before the white bull arrived among them, were by this hour in the patterns of their late afternoon grazing, moving slowly through the familiar ground of their pasture with the particular unhurried attention of large animals that have nothing to fear and nowhere specific to be. The white bull was among them. It had been in that meadow long enough that the ordinary cattle had adjusted to its presence, had reestablished the social arrangements of the herd around the new arrival, had stopped registering its unusual coat as something requiring a response. It grazed as they grazed. Its head dipped and rose. The afternoon light moved across its back. The wooden cow that Daedalus had built stood in the grass at whatever point it had been positioned, its wheels resting in the turf, its cowhide surface entirely still in the evening air. From a distance, when the warm late light of a Cretan afternoon, the structure was convincing enough that the eye that looked at it saw what it was designed to present: another animal standing in the field, oriented in the particular way that the field's geography and the wind's direction had made plausible. The hide did not move. There was no sound from within it. Whatever lived inside a real cow, the breath, the shift of weight, the small internal sounds of a large animal at rest, none of these were present in the wooden cow, and this was, perhaps, the element of the construction that relied most heavily on the rest of the scene to carry it. The grass around the structure was ordinary. The afternoon light was ordinary. The other cattle were going about the ordinary business of the late afternoon hour in the way they always did. And in an environment in which everything else was ordinary, a structure that presented an ordinary surface and asked no exceptional scrutiny of the creature that looked at it, had the best chance of being accepted at its face value. Daedalus had understood this. He had not built only an object. He had built an object designed for a specific context, for this meadow, for this bull, for this quality of late afternoon light, and this arrangement of ordinary cattle in the grass around it. Evening was coming. The light at the western edge of the meadow was already thickening, the shadow of the ridge above the field moving slowly across the grass as the sun descended behind it. The white bull moved through the herd with no awareness that the landscape it had grazed for weeks had been altered by the addition of one element whose nature was not what its surface presented. The ordinary cattle settled into their early evening positions. The shadows lengthened across the limestone ground and the short grass, and the wooden wheels of the structure that Daedalus had built, the wheels that pressed into the earth with the same indifference as the hooves of the cattle around them, pressing down without thought, without intention, without any awareness of what they were part of. The thing that is perhaps most worth noting about this moment, as the tradition allows it to be seen, is how ordinary the meadow looks from a sufficient distance. A broad field on the island of Crete, in the late afternoon of some unrecorded day in the deep past of the myth. Cattle grazing, the light going bronze, and then going amber, a line of hills in the background, or the glint of the sea somewhere below, depending on which part of the island the field occupies, in the story's geography. And in the grass, one structure that is not what it appears to be, standing very still, its hide perfectly smooth over the wooden frame beneath, its wheels invisible in the turf, waiting to do the thing it had been made to do. The tradition that holds this image is very old. The Bibliotheca of Apollodorus compiled it from sources older still. Bacchylides, the lyric poet of the 5th century before the Common Era, knew the story in a form whose details the surviving fragments only partially preserve. Diodorus Siculus placed it in a historical framework and described it with the same matter-of-fact attention he gave to other events he was cataloging. The story moved through Greek literary culture the way the most durable stories move, carried because it describes something true about the relationship between impiety and consequence, between divine gifts improperly retained and the transformations that followed from that retention. It was not considered a strange story in its time and in the culture that preserved it. It was considered a story about how things worked, about the specific logic by which the world of the gods and the world of mortals intersected and sometimes collided. Pasiphae had stood that morning in the doorway of the palace. The sea was visible from there, down the hill and across the lower ground, a brightness at the horizon. The sky in the early morning, before the sun had fully cleared the edge of the world, was the color of pale bronze, a color that holds all the warmth the day will eventually carry, but has not yet released it, a color that is not quite any single color, but the space between the darkness that has just ended and the light that is still gathering itself. She had stood there and looked at the sea, and whatever she carried in that moment, the tradition does not record in detail and does not require us to pursue. What the tradition requires is the wooden cow, finished and wheeled out into the meadow, standing in the grass in the long afternoon light, with its cowhide perfectly smooth and its seams invisible, its wheels resting without sound in the turf, the evening coming on around it. Daedalus had gone back to the palace. His work on this commission was complete. The object he had built stood in the field and waited, the way made things wait, without consciousness, without impatience, without any awareness of the change it represented. The white bull grazed somewhere in the meadow. The ordinary cattle moved through their late afternoon patterns. The light continued its slow descent toward the low hills or the sea. It is possible to hold this image for some time without needing to move past it. The field, the evening air, warm and still, carrying whatever the Cretan meadows carry in their air in the late afternoon, dry grass, limestone, the faint salt of the sea, the wooden structure standing in the grass with no sound coming from within it, its form convincing enough in the failing light that the distance and the dusk rendered it simply a part of the field, the wheels barely visible in the turf, the hide not moving, the shadows of the other cattle lengthening across the ground as the sun continued its work of going down. What had been set in motion was not yet visible in the meadow. The meadow looked like a meadow at dusk, which is to say, it looked like the end of an ordinary afternoon. The cattle were settling. The light was changing. The white bull, somewhere in that field, was doing what the evening called for, standing or grazing or moving through the familiar ground of the pasture, with the slow authority of an animal that has no understanding of what the wooden form standing in the grass nearby will make possible, has no understanding of its own origin or its own role in the chain of events that began the morning. It rose from the sea, has no understanding of anything beyond the grass and the evening air and the proximity of the herd. The wooden cow stood in the grass and waited. The evening came around it. The air went still. The world that it stood in, that broad Cretan meadow, that particular afternoon, that field full of ordinary cattle and one extraordinary white bull, continued about its quiet business as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. The wooden frame and the cowhide and the small wheels pressing into the turf had been placed there deliberately by the most capable craftsman then living, in response to a chain of events that had begun with a prayer and a promise and a beautiful animal rising from the sea. The meadow did not know this. The cattle did not know this. The white bull, moving through the grass as the evening thickened around the field, did not know it either. The change that had already happened was invisible to everything in that landscape, including the wooden structure that embodied it, silent, still, and perfectly at home in the dusk, as though it had always been there, as though it were simply another part of the world, resting in the grass with its wheels barely pressing into the turf and the evening going quietly on around it. A black figure vessel from the 6th century BCE. Hold it for a moment in two hands. Feel the weight of it, the cool, smooth surface of the clay beneath the glaze. The glaze itself, a deep black that is not quite uniform, that shifts slightly in the light, the way a very dark lake shifts. Holding the light differently at different angles, the shape is an amphora, two handles rising from the shoulders, the body widest at the middle, narrowing toward the foot. The neck is plain. The decoration runs in a band around the body, and it is precise, the figures painted with the confident, unhurried lines of a craftsman who knew the tradition well enough to work quickly without losing the sharpness of a contour. There are several figures. The eye moves along them and pauses. One figure is different from the others. The human figures around it are rendered in the standard conventions of the black figure style. Profile heads, forward-facing torsos, legs in the sideways stride, that Athenian painters used to suggest motion. They carry weapons. They are in the postures of engagement, but the figure at the center of the painted scene has above a human body with human arms and human proportions at the hip and thigh, the unmistakable head of a bull, curved horns, a broad bovine muzzle, the ears set wide, the neck thick where it meets the human shoulders. The lines around it are exactly as confident as the lines around the human figures. There is no hesitation in the painting, no sense that the craftsman found the image strange. He had painted this figure before. His workshop had painted it many times. The image was entirely familiar. This is the Minotaur, as the Greek tradition held it. This is the being that ancient sources named, separately from its more famous designation, Asterion. The personal name Asterion appears in the Bibliotheca, attributed to Apollodorus, that comprehensive gathering of Greek mythological tradition likely compiled in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, drawing on sources considerably older than itself. The Bibliotheca gives the creature both names, names it straightforwardly, in the matter-of-fact register characteristic of that work, which moves through the whole architecture of Greek myth with the brisk efficiency of a cataloger. The Minotaur is what it is by its nature. Asterion is what it is by name, and that name, the name that means something close to starry, or of the stars, or pertaining to the heavens, has always sat at a particular angle to the creature it was given to, a luminous name pressed against a monstrous form, neither one canceling the other. The name Asterion was not unique in the tradition. An early king of Crete, a figure from the older mythological stratum that preceded the fully developed Greek tradition, also bore it. Some scholars working in this area have suggested that the name preserves the memory of that earlier figure, a Cretan king or hero, or perhaps something closer to a divine being, remembered in the region's pre-Hellenic past, who was gradually assimilated into the later myth of the monster in the maze. What the two Asterions share is the name and the island, and perhaps something harder to articulate, a presence that the tradition kept returning to, a figure it felt the need to hold, whether as king or creature. The Bibliotheca exploits this quietly, placing the luminous name beside the creature's description without comment, without any apparent awareness that there might be something worth explaining in the combination. In that text, Asterion is simply what Asterion is. The name carries its old light. The creature carries its horns. Both are stated, and the paragraph moves on. The word the Greek tradition used more commonly, the word that passed through Latin into every European language that subsequently encountered the myth, was Minotauros. The form is straightforward enough as compounds go: Minos, the king, and Tauros, the Greek word for bull. Bull of Minos. Minos is bull. A possessive and compound form that attributes the creature to its genealogical context rather than naming it in its own nature. The Minotaur is defined by its relationship to a king, to a royal house, to the circumstances of its origin. Asterion is defined by something in the sky. Both names were present in the tradition, and both were used, and together they hold the creature from two very different angles, one looking upward, one looking sideways at the human world the creature was born into and could not inhabit. The form of the creature in ancient sources is not entirely consistent, and the inconsistency is worth holding for a moment, because it says something about how the tradition worked. The version that dominates, the version that appears on the overwhelming majority of surviving painted pottery, the version that Apollodorus describes, the version that passed into later tradition, gives the Minotaur a human body below the neck and a bull's head above it. This is the arrangement that the painter of the amphora knew. It is the arrangement that makes a certain visual sense, The creature walks upright, has hands, has the general shape of a person moving through a space, and then resolves at the shoulders into something entirely other. The head of an animal that does not belong on those shoulders, the eyes of a bull above the posture of a man. The Athenian vase painters rendered this without any apparent difficulty. The conventions of the black figure style were well suited to it. Profile heads were already the norm. A bull's head in profile, with its particular geometry of horn and muzzle and eye, translated into the vocabulary of the style with perfect ease. Other ancient accounts, and there are a handful of them, describe the creature as something more genuinely blended, bovine and human features distributed more ambiguously throughout the form, the boundary between the two natures less clearly located. These versions are rarer in the surviving record, and they are harder to visualize with the same confidence, which may be part of why the cleaner, more stable image of bull head-on human body became the version that persisted. But the ambiguity in these older or variant accounts is worth noting because it suggests that the tradition was not always certain exactly how the two natures were arranged. And that uncertainty is its own kind of meaning, a being so genuinely between categories that even the people telling the story could not agree on where the division fell. Ovid saw this, or at least Ovid's treatment of the creature in the Metamorphoses makes clear that he was thinking about this particular problem, the problem of how language handles a being that does not fit a single grammatical slot. The Metamorphoses is Ovid's great poem of transformation, the written in the last decade before the Common Era, a work in Latin hexameters that moves through the whole of Greek and Roman mythological tradition, from the creation of the world to the apotheosis of Julius Caesar, finding in every story an instance of a form becoming another form. Into this context, the Minotaur arrives in Book 8, and Ovid describes it with two phrases that he places in deliberate tension with each other, semibovum virum, semivir bovum. The first phrase, half bull man, the second, half man bull. The word order reverses. In the first phrase, the bovine nature comes first. The creature is, grammatically speaking, approached from the bull's side, and the human element is secondary. In the second phrase, the human nature comes first, approached from the person's side, the bovine element secondary. Neither phrase settles. Each one tilts the creature toward a different nature, without ever landing there fully. Ovid places them side by side in a way that makes clear he was not being imprecise, but being deliberately, carefully precise about an imprecision, documenting that the Latin language, like any language, could approach the creature, but could not contain it, that the grammar bent and shifted around it, the way the passages of the Labyrinth bent and shifted. This is what the name Asterion allows that the compound Minotaurus does not. Minotaurus locates the creature in its human genealogical context, Minos's bull, belonging to Minos's story, a consequence in the long chain of consequences that the Cretan royal house was working through. Asterion removes it from that context entirely, or nearly entirely, and places it under the sky, not in a palace, not in a maze, not in the catalogue of a king's transgressions, but somewhere with stars in it, somewhere wide and old. The two names together suggest a tradition that was trying to hold two different ways of understanding the same being, and had not decided which one was finally correct, which may mean that neither one was. The creature existed in the tradition the way it existed in Ovid's paired phrases, between the two arrangements, in the gap where no single description settled. The being that the tradition records was, by all ancient accounts that address the matter directly, sustained on human flesh. Apollodorus states this plainly. Diodorus Siculus, the 1st century BCE historian, and mythographer, whose Bibliotheca Historica provides a parallel account of the Cretan myth, states it as well. The fact is consistent across sources that are otherwise independent, which makes it a stable element of the myth rather than a detail invented by any single tradition. It is stated plainly and moved through. The ancient sources do not dwell on it. They note it in the same register they used to note other aspects of the creature's nature. What it ate was part of what it was, part of the inventory of its being, a fact that explained the arrangement Minos eventually made with Athens and that gave the whole complex of the labyrinth its particular stakes. Without that detail, the maze is a strange architectural project with an unusual inhabitant. With it, the maze becomes a necessary structure, and the creature inside it becomes something that required its own form of management. The pottery record that survives from ancient Greece, particularly the black figure vessels of the 6th century BCE and the red figure vessels that followed through the 5th, offers a specific and consistent picture. The Minotaur on these vessels is almost always shown in one of two contexts, inside the labyrinth and in combat with Theseus. The labyrinth itself is rarely depicted with any architectural specificity. The maze is usually implied by the general darkness of the scene or the absence of any location markers, rather than shown as a building. The Minotaur appears in these scenes in the posture that the conventions of the style allowed for combat: crouching, lunging, falling, one arm raised, the bull's head turned to face its opponent. The horns are always present. The human body, the proportions of the arms, the musculature of the legs, the posture that organizes the figure around a human skeleton is always present. The combination appears so consistently across so many workshops in so many decades that it has clearly been standardized. Vase painters in Corinth and Athens and across the Aegean were all working from a shared visual vocabulary that had settled on this image and held it. The red figure style, which emerged in Athens in the late 6th century and allowed for significantly more nuanced rendering of anatomy and expression, produced images of the Minotaur that are in some ways more unsettling than the black figure versions, not because they reach for a darker register, but because the increased precision of the style makes the combination of bull and human more anatomically convincing. The red figure Minotaur has muscles rendered with the same care as the human athletes and heroes around it. The bull's head sits on those muscles with a specificity that the more schematic black figure style didn't quite achieve. The face of the bull in red figure can be examined more closely, the eye set in the side of the head as a bull's eye is, the muzzle broad and forward, the ears positioned wide, and the face, for all that it is painted by a craftsman who knew bull anatomy well, carries what might be read as an expression, though the convention of the style and the nature of a bull's face make it impossible to say whether the craftsman intended this or the viewer brings it. The creature looks like something. What it looks like depends on who is looking. A scholar studying these vessels, turning them in carefully gloved hands in a museum storeroom, or examining high-resolution photographs of the painted scenes, would notice that the Minotaur's human body is consistently rendered with the same care given to human heroes. The arms are drawn with attention to the musculature of the forearm and the upper arm. The legs are in the proportions of an adult male at full physical development. This is not a deformed or degraded human body with a bull's head placed on it. This is a fully realized human body, painted with the same skill and the same positive attention that Athenian craftsmen brought to heroes and athletes and gods. The bull's head is not a sign of diminishment, but a fact about the figure, present alongside the human body without overriding it or making it less. The creature's two natures coexist in the painting, the way they coexist in Ovid's paired phrases, each one complete, each one present, neither one resolving the other. Minoan Crete, the civilization that occupied the island from roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE, the civilization whose palace at Knossos lies under the reconstructed ruins that visitors walk through today, was a world saturated with bulls. The evidence for this comes from what archaeologists have recovered from palace sites across the island. Ceramic vessels shaped like bullheads, called rhyta, used in ritual contexts for pouring libations. Frescoes showing bulls in full charge with human figures in dynamic relation to them. Stone carvings, seal stones. The bull appears in Minoan material culture with a regularity and a formality that suggests the animal held a position of deep significance in Minoan religious and symbolic life, not merely as livestock or as a general symbol of strength, but as something that belonged to the sacred order of the world as the Minoans understood it. The double-headed axe that appears throughout Knossos as a carved mark on column bases and as a freestanding cult object, the Labyrinth, the symbol whose name may lie behind the word labyrinth itself, was associated with the bull in Minoan iconography, its paired blades mirroring the paired horns in a symmetry that appears to have been ritually meaningful. What is absent from the Minoan visual record, at least from everything that has survived, is any unambiguous depiction of the creature the Greeks described. There is no painting, no ceramic figure, no seal stone image that shows a being with a human body and a bull's head in the combination that became standard in Athenian black figure pottery. The bull is everywhere in Minoan art. The bull, in combination with the human body, appears in the bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos, those extraordinary paintings showing male and female figures in the act of vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. But those images show humans and bulls in relation to each other, not fused into a single form. The creature that the Greeks knew and painted and wrote about does not appear to have been depicted in Minoan art, at least not in any form that has survived the 3.5 millennia since the Minoan civilization's decline. This silence does not mean the Greek myth has no connection to Minoan Crete. The connection may be preserved in a different way. The tradition is dense with Cretan details, the specific geography, the court of Minos, the craftsmen brought from Athens to serve the Cretan king, the underground structure built to contain something the palace could not otherwise manage. These are details that carry the weight of a long transmission through many tellings, surviving as recognizable residue of an older relationship between the Greek mainland and the island. But the precise nature of that relationship, the specific Minoan practices or beliefs or figures that the later myth transformed and transmitted, remains genuinely unclear. The linear A script that the Minoans used for administrative and possibly religious texts has not been deciphered. Their religion is reconstructed from material culture without the support of a translated religious literature. The silence in the textual record is real. What fills that silence is the pottery of later Greeks, the rhyta from the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, the ceramic bullhead vessels, their surfaces painted or sculpted with attention to the specific anatomy of a bull's face, the broad muzzle, the ears, the wide-set eyes, are not the Minotaur. They are the bull in its own form, honored in its own form, poured through in ritual. But they are the material from which the myth was eventually made, or something like it, the deep familiarity with the bull's presence in Cretan sacred life, the long history of the animal as something that mattered in the religious architecture of the island, the accumulated significance that the later Greek tradition could draw on when it needed a creature whose origins were rooted in Crete and in its particular relationship to the divine and the bestial. The Bibliotheca of Apollodorus gives the creature its name, both names and its description, and moves efficiently through the events surrounding it without spending long on any single element. The style of that work is catalog rather than narrative, and the Minotaur receives the same brisk, precise treatment as the other beings and events it documents. Diodorus Siculus writes with somewhat more expansiveness, but similar efficiency. Neither source treats the creature as requiring extended description, which is itself a kind of document. By the time these works were compiled, the image of the Minotaur was so well established in the shared visual and literary culture of the Greek world that the authors could name it and note its nature and trust their readers to fill in the rest from everything they had already encountered. The red figure vases had been circulating for 3 centuries, the black figure vases for longer. The image of the bull-headed figure in a human body was as familiar as any figure in the tradition, available to everyone who grew up in the Greek world without requiring an explanation any more elaborate than a name. This is one of the interesting things about a myth that has lasted as long as this one has. It reaches a point where the image carries its own weight, where the tradition of the image is itself a kind of authority, where the creature with the bull's head becomes more real in the sense of being more reliably present in the culture than any single text about it. The painted vessel is held in the hands, the image is examined, the horns are clearly there, the human body is clearly there. The creature is clearly both things and neither one singly, and this quality of being between categories is not a problem the image is trying to solve, but a fact it is trying to hold. The painter paints it, the tradition keeps it. The name Asterion sits inside the myth like a small light, and the name Minotauros sits beside it like a record of origin and ownership. Between the two names, the creature simply is what it is. The surface of the amphora in 2 hands is cool and smooth and dark. The painted scene runs around the body of the vessel, the figures in their profile stances, the action compressed into the conventions of the style. The Minotaur is at the center of the scene. Its human body is in the posture of someone who has been moving and has stopped, or who is about to move. The bull's head is turned slightly, the painted eye looking at nothing in particular, or at everything at once in the way that the flat conventions of the style produce. The horns curve clearly above the human shoulders. The figure stands in the scene with a quality that is difficult to name exactly, not threatening in the painted image, not distressed, not in any particular relation to the human figures around it, beyond the fact of its presence there among them, unmistakably itself, carrying both its natures in the lines of dark glaze on pale clay. Somewhere in the storage rooms of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum on Crete, on shelves that hold fragments and complete vessels recovered from Minoan sites across the island, there are bullhead rhyta, ceramic, some of them 3,000 years old or more. Their muzzles are broad, their painted or sculpted eyes wide set and open. They were made to be held, to be filled with liquid for ritual use, to be tipped and poured in some ceremonial context, whose exact nature, without the linear A texts to explain it, remains beyond full reconstruction. They hold their bovine forms patiently on their museum shelves, as they have held them across a very long time. The eyes open, the horns present in whatever form the particular vessel preserves them, the hollow interior waiting as a vessel always waits for whatever the ritual required. The creature the Greeks described is not quite these vessels. The Minotaur with its human body and bovine head moving through the passages of a maze built to contain it, bearing the luminous name Asterion, in addition to its compound designation, That creature belongs to the later myth, to the Greek tradition that gathered and transformed and transmitted what it knew or believed or inherited about Crete and its bulls and its kings and its underground architecture. But the Rista are the depth that the myth stands over. They are the evidence that the bull had been significant on this island for longer than the myth can fully account for, that the animal's presence in Cretan sacred life was woven into the material culture of the civilization at every level, in the vessels used for ritual, in the frescoes on the palace walls, in the stone marks on column bases, in the accumulated visual language of a world that found in the bull something worth honoring in permanent forms. The writing on its museum shelf carries no particular expression. It is a bull's face, rendered by a Minoan craftsman with a specific and practiced skill, the features anatomically recognizable even after 3 millennia of existence. The hollow eye sockets hold the museum's preservation light without reflecting it, the interior dark, the form complete. It does not know what myth was eventually made from the animal it depicts, or what creature would eventually inherit both the name that means starry and the designation that ties it to a king. It is simply a bull's head in ceramic, old and particular and intact. The tradition continued. The image persisted. On the black figure vessels made in Athenian workshops, 2 centuries or more after the Minoan civilization had ended, the bull returned in its new form, the head on human shoulders, the horns above the painted scene, the creature moving through the compact mythology of the Greek tradition with the same confidence the Minoan bull had moved through its own. The two things are not the same, but one holds the depth of the other, and the writing on its museum shelf, its eye sockets open in the preservation light of the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, is as much the ancestor of the Minotaur as any mythological lineage, older than Minos, older than the maze, older than the name Asterion, as old as the island's long, quiet relationship with the animal, whose face it made into a vessel for sacred use. In the 11th book of Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus stands at the edge of the world and looks down into a place where no living person has any right to be. The underworld he sees is lit by no sun, warmed by no fire. It holds the pale and purposeless shapes of those who have finished living, pressing forward at the rim of a pit he has dug, drawn by the smell of blood he has poured as an offering. And among the shades he watches, keeping his distance, not approaching, only observing, is a figure seated on a throne, holding a golden scepter, with the dead arranged before him and still presenting their disputes. The figure is Minos, the scepter is gold. The dead press close because this, Homer says, is what Minos does in death, as he did in life. He judges. That image, the king with his scepter, the crowd of shades, the courtroom carried whole into the underworld, is not the image of a king best remembered for the creature locked beneath his palace. It is the image of a lawgiver. The word Homer uses for what Minos does in the underworld is the same word used for the administration of justice among the living. And the scene belongs to a part of the Odyssey where the great dead are shown going about their characteristic activities in permanent repetition. Sisyphus pushing his stone, Orion hunting, Tantalus reaching for water that recedes. What Minos does in the underworld is what defined him in life. He passes judgment. He weighs disputes. He keeps an order among those who no longer have a world in which to need one. The Minos that Greek tradition preserved was, in the oldest accounts, not primarily a figure of scandal or catastrophe. He was a great king. He was the son of Zeus himself, of Zeus and Europa, the Phoenician princess carried to Crete on the god's back when he transformed himself into a white bull and waded into the sea, and that divine parentage gave Minos a kind of foundational authority that the tradition consistently maintained, even as it also maintained the story of the creature beneath his palace. Both things were held at once, the lawgiver on his throne with the golden scepter, and the structure built in secret into the hill below the palace grounds. Greek mythology was not organized for consistency, it was organized for completeness. What was said about a figure was kept and added to, and the layers were allowed to rest together without anyone requiring them to resolve. Homer does not mention the labyrinth in the passage in the Odyssey. He does not mention the creature. He gives Minos the scepter and the court of shades, and leaves the rest of the tradition to be carried by other sources. It is a small fact worth holding that for Homer, or at least for the Homer who arranged the Odyssey in the form that survived, the defining image of Minos was judicial authority. The scepter is golden, not because of decoration, but because gold in the Homeric world is the material of gods and of what the gods sanction. The king who sat with a golden scepter in the underworld had been given that scepter by something larger than himself. His authority persisted after death because it had always been that kind of authority. Crete itself, the island Minos ruled in the tradition, was a real place, and the civilization that preceded the Greek world on that island was a real civilization, though one whose relationship to the myths about Minos remains difficult and interesting. The Minoan civilization, which is what archaeologists call it now, using Evans's word for the palace at Knossos and everything that radiated from it, flourished across a long period that scholars place roughly from 2700 to 1450 BCE. It was a sophisticated and extensively connected world. Its ships moved across the Mediterranean with goods and perhaps ideas. Its palaces were multi-story and elaborately organized. Its people made pottery of considerable refinement, painted their walls with images that still read as vivid across more than 3,000 years of distance, and administered an economy complex enough to require writing. They had writing, two of them, actually, Linear A, which remains undeciphered, and an earlier hieroglyphic script that is similarly opaque. The silence at the center of everything claimed about Minoan religion and Minoan belief is the silence of those two unread scripts. What the Minoans themselves said about their gods, their world, their kings, whatever was written in Linear A on the clay tablets that have survived, cannot yet be read by any living person. That silence matters. It means that what we have of Minoan religion comes almost entirely from two sources that were not Minoan. The archaeological record, which shows what was built and painted and buried, but cannot say what it meant to those who made it, and the Greek literary tradition, which recorded what later Greeks believed or imagined about the Cretan world that preceded them. The bull imagery that saturates the Minoan archaeological record, the bull-headed rhyta used for ritual pouring, the bull-leaping frescoes on the walls at Knossos, the horns of consecration mounted on palace architecture, all of it visible, all of it clearly significant, and all of it requiring interpretation from outside, because the inside of the Minoan explanatory tradition has not yet been recovered. What the bull meant to the people who built Knossos, who painted the leaping figures on their walls, who poured libations through vessels shaped like bull skulls. This is one of the genuinely open questions that the archaeological record preserves without answering. Arthur Evans arrived at Knossos in 1900. He was a British archaeologist with considerable resources and a long-standing conviction that there was something to find there. And what he found, what the excavation gradually brought out of the Cretan earth, was the largest Minoan palace complex yet identified. The palace covered approximately 1 hectares. It contained, in Evans's estimate, at least 1,300 rooms. It had throne rooms, and storage magazines, and light wells, and corridors that changed direction without obvious reason, staircases that descended into basement levels and opened onto upper terraces, ceremonial spaces adjacent to functional ones. The whole thing organized according to a logic that Evans found as fascinating as it was difficult to follow. He restored parts of it, controversially. The reinforced concrete columns, painted in Minoan colors, that stand there now are Evans's, not the Minoans, and that restoration has been debated by archaeologists ever since. But the structure beneath the restoration is genuinely ancient, and its genuine complexity is not a matter of Evans's interpretation. The palace is that way. It spreads in that many directions. The rooms are that numerous, the connections between them that non-obvious. Evans named it the Palace of Minos. It was a reasonable enough choice. Minos was what the Greek tradition associated with Crete's great king and great palace, and Evans was working in a period when connecting the archaeological record to the literary tradition was standard practice. What he could not know, and what his successors have not been able to fully resolve, is how much the Greek mythological tradition about Minos and the Labyrinth might encode, or distort, or simply invent about the civilization that preceded it. The palace Evans excavated was not built in the Bronze Age by a king named Minos, whose wife was afflicted by a god, and whose stepson was sealed underground. It was built by a civilization we cannot read, administered by a system we cannot reconstruct from its own documents, and worshipped gods whose names and natures have not been recovered. The Minos of the Greek tradition may preserve something of a real Cretan king, or of a title. Some scholars have proposed that Minos was a title rather than a personal name, like Pharaoh, or of nothing but later Greek imagining, about a place that was already ancient and ruined by the time the Greeks were telling stories about it. All of these possibilities remain open. The throne room Evans excavated and partly restored is a small room that surprises most people who see it for the first time or see descriptions of it. The Minos of the literary tradition was the most powerful ruler in the Aegean, a naval king whose fleet made him the effective master of the surrounding seas. His palace ought to have a great hall, a room of spectacle and authority. The throne room at Knossos has a low gypsum throne set against the north wall, a stone basin sunk into the floor before it, for what Evans believed were ritual purposes, and griffins painted in fresco on either side of the throne, mythological creatures, part lion and part bird, the Minoan ones rendered with a sinuous naturalism that distinguishes them from later Greek or Egyptian versions of the same creature. The ceiling is low. The light enters at an angle from a small anteroom. The overall effect is not of a space designed for public display of power, but of something more enclosed, more ritual, more concerned with whatever happened at the center of the room than with whatever impression the room made on observers standing at its edge. Alongside that throne room, and running beneath parts of the palace and extending away from it in underground corridors, were the storage magazines that held the palace economy together. These are long, narrow rooms, some of them still in their original condition, enormous ceramic storage jars called pithoi, standing in rows, their surfaces impressed with rope-pattern decoration, some of them taller than a person, their interiors once filled with oil or grain or whatever else the palace administration needed to hold in quantity. The magazines were the working infrastructure of the palace. What the throne room faced outward and above, the magazines faced inward and down, and between them they defined two poles of the same complex, the ceremonial and the economic, the visible authority and the stored resource. Walking through the storage corridors at Knossos has a particular quality. The jars are original, the stone floor is original, the low ceiling presses down, and the overall sense is of a space designed around function rather than impression, a place where things were kept rather than performed. In the Greek literary tradition, the civilization Minos ruled made him a naval power of unusual scope and reach. Thucydides, in the opening section of his History of the Peloponnesian War, pauses to note that Minos was the first person of whom we have knowledge to have established a navy, and that he used that navy to suppress piracy in the Aegean, framing Minos, in passing, as a civilizing force, a king who made the sea safer for trade. Thucydides was not primarily interested in mythology. He was making a point about sea power and its historical role in Aegean commerce, and he reached for Minos as his earliest available example. That a figure from deep mythological tradition should appear in Thucydides' sober, evidence-conscious historical argument is a reminder of how the ancient world understood the boundary between history and myth differently than the modern world does. Minos was, for Thucydides, something like a historical precedent, the earliest case of Aegean thalassocracy, the earliest demonstration of what a dominant fleet could accomplish. That naval power, in the version of the myth that survived most fully, was eventually turned against Athens. The account that Plutarch gives in his Life of Theseus, the fullest synthesis of the tribute myth that remains, describes what brought Athens and Crete into the specific arrangement that defined the story. Minos had a son named Androgeus, and Androgeus had gone to Athens for the Panathenaic Games, where he won prizes and was received with considerable honor by the Athenians. What happened afterward is given in variant accounts. In one version, Androgeus was killed by a bull. In another, he was killed by Athenian jealousy of his victories. In another, the king of Athens sent him against the bull of Marathon, knowing the animal would kill him, making the death a calculated assassination rather than an accident. Plutarch names the variants and does not adjudicate between them. The result was the same across all versions. Androgeus died on Attic soil, and Minos, informed of his son's death, made war on Athens to seek redress. The war went badly for Athens. The tradition does not depict the conflict in detail. It is background, the established context for what comes after, but the outcome is clear. Athens could not match the Cretan fleet. The city could not sustain the campaign against a naval power of Minos' scale. And so Athens agreed to terms. The terms were the tribute, 7 young men and 7 young women, sent from Athens to Crete at intervals the tradition specifies variously as annual or every 9 years. Plutarch notes both traditions to be delivered to the labyrinth. Ancient sources are careful about what happens inside the labyrinth once the tribute is delivered. They do not describe a sacrifice at the entrance, or a ceremony, or a clean dispatch. The youths were sent into the passages. The labyrinth was a structure built to prevent navigation, designed around the specific property of making it impossible for a person unfamiliar with its layout to find a way out. Inside those passages, eventually they would encounter the creature that lived at their center. The tribute ship sailed from Athens with black sails. That detail, preserved in Plutarch and carried through other sources, is the image the tradition settled on to represent the journey, the dark cloth against the Aegean sky, visible from shore as the ship moved out of the harbor, legible to anyone who saw it as a sign of grief and surrender. The ship was not carrying cargo or conducting trade. Its black sails announced what it carried and where it was going, the way a funeral procession announces itself through what it is and how it moves. The harbor at Athens in the early morning of a departure day The ship at anchor, the sails still furled and dark against the pale light, the dock not yet busy, the city on its hill still in shadow, above the water, is the tradition's image of a humiliation held at a specific recurring interval. Athens was, in this period of the myth, a city that had agreed to send its young people across the Aegean on a ship with black sails, and the interval at which the ships were sent was regular enough to be anticipated, to be prepared for, to be part of the city's calendar of obligations. Plutarch's Life of Theseus is a complicated document to read as a mythological source. Plutarch was writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, drawing on sources that were themselves already centuries old, and he was writing biography, a genre concerned with character and its illustration through action, rather than mythology or history in the strict senses of either. He acknowledges variant traditions openly, notes where his sources disagree, and sometimes admits that a given detail cannot be confirmed. His Theseus is constructed from layers, and Plutarch is aware of the layers, even as he arranges them into a coherent narrative. What that produces is a document that is simultaneously a primary source on how the Greeks of Plutarch's era understood the Theseus cycle, and a record of the scholarly uncertainty that surrounded it even in antiquity. The tribute myth, the black sails, the periodic shipments of youth, the agreement between Athens and Crete was already old when Plutarch was writing about it, already carried by a tradition he was synthesizing rather than originating. The sea crossing from Athens to Crete is approximately 260 kilometers across open water. In the ancient world, that was a significant distance, not impossible. The Aegean was a regularly traveled sea, but not a short passage either. The tribute ship would have been out of sight of Athens before it was in sight of anything else, in the particular open water position, where the horizon is sea in every direction, and the destination is as invisible as the origin. The ancient Aegean had its particular conditions, the meltemy winds that blow strongly from the north in summer, the chop and brightness of the open sea, the moment when land finally resolves out of the haze on the southern horizon, and what emerges is the long mountainous shape of Crete. The tradition does not linger on that crossing. It is interested in what happens at both ends, the departure and the arrival, and allows the sea between them to be simply distance, the space that separated two worlds, which were briefly, periodically, tragically connected by a political arrangement made under the pressure of military defeat. The political architecture of the tribute is worth holding for a moment, not because it resolves into any single interpretation, but because it accumulates meaning in different directions at once. The tribute was a military outcome, Athens defeated, Athens compelled to terms by a power it could not match. It was a recurring wound, not a single one. The ships went out periodically. The agreement was renewed through enforcement rather than renegotiation. It was also, within the myth, a specifically domestic catastrophe. The young people taken were Athenian, and the tradition emphasized their ordinariness, not criminals, not enemies, not prisoners of war in any conventional sense, but simply young and Athenian and chosen. Plutarch describes Theseus's father, the king Aegeus, as part of the drawing of lots, an image of royal participation in the community's suffering that has a specific quality. The father of the next king of Athens, standing at the lottery alongside all the other fathers, with the same exposure as everyone else. Whether or not that detail was historically imaginable within any ancient Greek political reality is not the question the tradition is organized around. The question is what kind of king Theseus's father was, and what kind of obligation that created for Theseus himself. The world above the labyrinth, The world of Minos and his court, the Cretan palatial civilization, with its storerooms and its throne room, and its remarkable frescoes still on the walls, was a world of considerable complexity and, in the tradition, of considerable power. Minos judged the living, he would later in death judge the dead. His court contained Daedalus, the finest craftsman of the age, whose skills made him useful enough that Minos wished to keep him. His navy patrolled the Aegean. His tribute arrangements with Athens were stable enough to persist across years and the reigns of Athenian kings. The power of Crete in the tradition is not explained by cruelty. It is explained by the same combination of divine ancestry, organizational capacity, and military strength that explain the power of any ancient Mediterranean kingdom. Minos was, in the world the tradition built, simply the most powerful king in his region, and his power expressed itself in the ordinary ways that power expressed itself in that world, through law, through force, through the ability to compel distant cities to honor arrangements that disadvantaged them. Linear A, the script the Minoans used to administer their palace economy, is stamped and incised onto clay tablets that have been recovered from several Minoan sites. The tablets are small, most of them fit in one hand, and they are covered in orderly rows of marks that share a family resemblance with the later Linear B script, which was an adaptation of Linear A for the Greek language, and which was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris. The decipherment of Linear B was possible because it encoded Greek, and Greek could be worked backward into the script once enough tablets were available. Linear A has not yielded to the same approach because it does not appear to encode any language that has been identified and reconstructed from other evidence. The marks are there. They are clearly a writing system, clearly organized, clearly functional, used to record the palace economy's transactions, its receipts and disbursements, its tallies of agricultural produce and manufactured goods. And they are, at the moment of this writing, still unread. What the Minoan people wrote about themselves in that script, their kings, their gods, their understandings of the world, is kept in those marks without access. Sitting with that silence is a particular kind of experience. The Greek literary tradition produced documents about Minos and Crete and the creature in the labyrinth that are readable and were read, that moved from one language into another, that Ovid worked into Latin and Dante encountered in Latin, and every subsequent European tradition encountered through Dante and Ovid. That chain of transmission is visible and followable. The Minoan record sits alongside it, older, more material, in some ways more immediate, because it is the actual physical residue of the civilization the myths were built on top of, and it does not speak in any direction yet identified. The bull on the fresco at Knossos does not confirm or deny the Greek account of what that bull meant in Cretan religious life. The throne in the throne room does not confirm or deny that a king named Minos ever sat in it. The storage jars in the magazines hold their original silence, the way they once held oil or grain, sealed, substantial, and not available for interrogation. The Minos that Homer placed in the underworld with the golden scepter was not primarily a king of the labyrinth. He was a king of order, a figure whose defining function was judgment, weighing what the dead presented, applying to their cases whatever principle he had applied to the living cases before his throne. That the same tradition also maintained the other Minos, the one who broke his agreement with Poseidon and set the catastrophe in motion that would eventually cost him his craftsmen, his daughter's loyalty, and his political control over Athens, is simply the way myth works. Both are Minos. The tradition held them together without apology and without requiring the listener to choose between them, because the tradition was not making a biographical argument. It was carrying the full account of a king whose world was complicated enough to have produced, in the same reign, a golden scepter and a building constructed underground to hold something that should not exist. The harbor at Athens is where the tradition places its most specific grief. The black sail of the tribute ship is the tradition's image of what the city carried, the specific color of an obligation that could not be refused, repeated at intervals into the Athenian calendar until the city and the people in it simply incorporated the knowledge that this was something that happened, something the city did at regular intervals, something whose timing was known and whose content was unchanged. The harbor in the early morning light, before the full city has come down to watch, the ship at anchor, the sail dark in the pale morning air, the dock quiet, the sound of water against wood, the city above still, in the long blue shadow of a hill. The ship would carry what it carried, and the Aegean would be between Athens and Crete by the time the sun was high, and the tribute would arrive at its destination, and the arrangement would continue. The tradition does not describe what Minos felt at the receipt of the tribute, or whether he watched the ships arrive. It is not interested in that. The tradition is interested in the ship, the sail, the distance, and the quality of the world that contained the arrangement as a fact it had to absorb. The sea between Athens and Crete on a clear morning is a particular shade, pale at the horizon where the sky meets it, deepening toward the boat, catching light in a way that changes with the height of the sun and the direction of the wind. The Meltemi pushes the ship south. The distance resolves slowly into a longer, lower shape of land as Crete grows out of the haze on the southern edge of the visible world. The tribute ship would have arrived like any other ship through the same approaches, past the same landmarks, into the same harbor. What it carried was different from cargo. The harbor that received it was not, in the tradition, transformed by the arrival. The world continued around the ship's docking, as the world continues around any specific event that has been decided and prepared for and cannot be changed by feeling. The dark sail came to rest against the harbor at Crete. The arrangement proceeded. The Aegean sat between the two shores, as it always had, holding the distance between them as a fact of geography that meant, at this moment in the myth, also a fact of politics, and of the specific weight that a naval defeat places on the cities that lose. The black sail, furled against the harbor at Athens in the early morning, before the loading, before the departure, before the Aegean opened under the ship's hull and swallowed the sight of the city, is the tradition's still image of the moment before the obligation is performed. The city above it is quiet. The dock below it is quiet. The pale morning air holds the sail's dark cloth without wind, the harbor holding the ship in the same light that holds everything else in that early hour, when the distinction between water and sky is still soft and the day has not yet made itself distinct from the night that preceded it. The ship will leave when the morning is ready. The Aegean will carry it south. The sail will catch the light differently once the ship is moving, and the city will diminish on the horizon as the sea grows wider, and the long shape of Crete will eventually appear on the other side of all that open water, holding the world the tribute ship is traveling toward. The sail is dark against the pale morning. The ship is still at anchor. The distance between Athens and Crete is the Aegean in its full extent, wide, lit, indifferent to what crosses it, and there, Daedalus laid his tools out in a particular order. The chisels first, arranged by width along the edge of the workbench. Then the wooden mallets, 2 of them set down with their heads facing the same direction. Then the measuring cords, coiled and hanging from a peg above the bench, their length still bearing the chalk marks from whatever he had been measuring before. The workshop faced east, which meant that in the early morning the light came in low and direct, crossing the bench at an angle that threw every surface into clear relief. The grain of the wood, the pitting on the chisel handles, the slight unevenness of the stone floor, where the bench's legs had worn shallow depressions over years of use. He had arranged this workshop himself when Minos had first given him rooms at the palace. He had chosen the eastern exposure. Light in the morning meant the best working hours came first, before the heat of the afternoon turned the stone walls into a kind of slow oven, and before the quality of attention that difficult work required had spent itself on easier things. On this particular morning, the materials assembled against the far wall were not materials he had worked with before in this configuration. There was stone, not the large blocks that palace walls were made from, but smaller, carefully selected pieces, cut to workable dimensions and stacked in low rows with spacers between them to allow for air. There was timber, good timber, seasoned and straight, bundled and leaning. There was rope, a great deal of it, coiled in wide circles on the floor, and there were several clay tablets on the bench beside the tools, each one bearing marks Daedalus had made himself in the days before, marks that showed corridors and junctions, passages that turned back on themselves and then continued in directions that did not quite resolve into the directions in which they had begun. What he had been asked to build was a structure within the palace complex, or beneath it, or adjacent to it. The question of where the labyrinth was positioned relative to Knossos being one that ancient sources handled differently, and the ancient descriptions preferring the fact of it to the geography. The labyrinth, in the account given in the Bibliotheca attributed to Apollodorus, was an enclosure so constructed that anyone placed inside it could not find their way out without the guidance of the one who had designed it. It was not a simple locked room. It was not a single long corridor. It was a structure that defeated navigation by means of the structure itself, by the arrangement of passages and turnings and returns that refused to settle into any pattern a moving person could track and hold. The name Daedalus carried in Greek was itself a kind of description. The word Daedalus meant something close to cunningly wrought, intricately made, worked with the kind of skill that went beyond the technical into the almost living. A daedalon was an object so finely crafted that it seemed to exceed what craft alone could produce. The name was also a general word the Greeks applied to things of exceptional and somewhat uncanny workmanship, which meant that Daedalus moved through his own tradition as both a specific craftsman and a general principle, the embodiment of making carried to its furthest edge. He was Athenian by birth, a descendant of Erechtheus, which placed him in the oldest and most foundational lineage of Athenian myth. He had not left Athens willingly. The account that survives in Apollodorus describes a boy named Perdix, who was Daedalus's nephew. Perdix had been given to Daedalus to learn the craftsman's trade, and for a time the arrangement had served. Then the boy had demonstrated something Daedalus had not anticipated. He had begun to show signs of a different kind of intelligence, an inventive intelligence, the kind that sees the outline of a tool not yet made in the shape of a thing not yet constructed. The tradition holds that Perdix, examining the spine of a fish, understood from its serrated edge the principle of a cutting tool with multiple teeth and made the first saw. In some versions, it is a serpent's jaw, not a fish's spine, but in all versions the essential thing is the same. The nephew had seen what the uncle had not seen, and had made from that seeing something permanent and useful. Daedalus, who had been the finest craftsman in Athens, recognized in this a skill that might in time exceed his own. He killed the boy. He threw him from a height, from the Acropolis, in some accounts, and then he left Athens before the judgment that would inevitably follow. That exile had brought him to Crete, where Minos gave him workshop and rooms and put his abilities to use. He had been useful across the years at the Cretan court in more ways than one. The Bibliotheca places him at the center of several events in the royal family's history that were not public knowledge, which was part of why, after the labyrinth was built, Minos preferred to keep him on the island. A craftsman who knew the architecture of the royal family's secrets was a craftsman who could not be allowed to take those secrets elsewhere. On the morning that the labyrinth began, Daedalus unrolled one of the clay tablets on the bench and set weights at its corners. The marks he had made showed a layout that began clearly enough: a passage, a turning, another passage, and then became something else. The route doubled back. It returned toward its own beginning, without returning to it. It produced passages that looked identical from inside them, so that a person moving through the space would experience the same junction twice and understand it as a new one. This was the essential quality Ovid describes in the Metamorphoses, Daedalus building a structure that misled the sense of sight through passages obscurely winding, and Ovid adding, with a detail that was presumably drawn from the same lost sources he and Apollodorus shared, that even the builder himself was nearly lost when he finally walked through his own completed work. That detail in Ovid is worth sitting with. It is not offered as a warning or as evidence of something gone wrong. It is offered simply, the way a particularly interesting technical fact might be noted, to indicate that the labyrinth's confusing power was genuine and complete, not a relative difficulty that a trained mind could overcome through systematic effort, but an absolute spatial disorientation that operated on the person who understood the design as thoroughly as on the person who had never seen the plans. Whatever Daedalus had built, he had built something that could undo its own architect. The word labyrinth itself may carry an older memory than the myth that surrounds it. The Greek word labyrinthos does not have a clear Greek etymology. It belongs to a class of words with the characteristic ending that linguists associate with pre-Greek languages, words that were absorbed into Greek from whatever populations the Greeks encountered in the Aegean before their own arrival. The most widely cited proposed origin connects labyrinthos to labrys, which was the word used in antiquity for the double-headed axe, an instrument appearing so consistently throughout the material culture of Minoan Crete that Evans, when he began excavating Knossos at the beginning of the 20th century, identified it as a primary religious symbol of the civilization he was uncovering. The labyrinth appears incised into column bases at Knossos. It appears on stone vessels, on painted plaster, on bronze implements, worked into architectural surfaces throughout the palace complex. If the proposed etymology is correct, and it is proposed, not proven, the derivation being linguistically plausible rather than certain, then the labyrinth was known in the language of those who built it as something like the house of the double axe, or the place of the double axe, the shrine of the sign that marked everything Minoan sacred space was understood to mean. The labyrinth itself is symmetrical. That is its first quality, the one that strikes anyone looking at it. Two identical blades meeting at a central axis, neither side primary, neither edge more important than the other. As a symbol for a structure designed to defeat orientation, there is something apt in this. A maze properly constructed must also be symmetrical in its own way, folding back on itself, offering left and right with equal generosity, presenting every junction as undifferentiated from every other. The double axe and the double passage, the mark that meant sacred, the structure that meant lost. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, describes what he calls the four great labyrinths of the ancient world. In Book 36 of his Natural History, a work of such comprehensive ambition that it encompasses everything from the properties of marble to the history of painting to the natural philosophy of gems, Pliny lists the Cretan labyrinth alongside those of Egypt, Lemnos, and Italy, and he treats the list with the same matter-of-fact curiosity he brings to everything else he encounters. The Egyptian labyrinth he had considered personally, or consulted sources who had. He treats it as a real visitable structure, a vast complex of interconnected chambers that he describes in terms of its scale and the difficulty of moving through it. He gives it the same structural seriousness he gives the Cretan example, which has the effect of treating the Cretan labyrinth not as a mythological fiction, but as a member of a category of real ancient architecture, the category of buildings designed to be difficult to navigate. Pliny notes the tradition of 100 doorways, a detail that most ancient writers on the Cretan labyrinth eventually include, 100 doorways opening and closing automatically, in some versions, 100 doorways that all looked the same from inside. In others, the number 100 in ancient writing often functions less as a count than as a way of indicating a quantity that defeats enumeration. Too many to remember, too many to track, enough that the counting itself becomes part of the confusion. But Pliny sets it down as a feature of the building's reported plan, alongside the note that finding one's way through the interior without a guide was effectively impossible. He does not claim to have verified it personally. He records it with the same scrupulous if this is accurate quality that runs through much of his natural history, the encyclopedist's characteristic acknowledgement that some things come to him through others and are offered as such. The plan drawing made by archaeologists of the Knossos Palace complex, when placed beside Pliny's description, produces an interesting overlap of feeling, if not of detail. The plan, and anyone who has looked carefully at the archaeological maps of the site will understand this, shows a structure that has no single axis, no obvious perimeter, no clear main entrance that resolves into an equally clear interior logic. Rooms open into rooms. Corridors lead to light wells that open onto further corridors. Storage magazines. The long, narrow underground rooms where the great Pythoi stood. The ceramic storage jars taller than a person, their surfaces impressed with rope patterns from the molds in which they were made, extend in rows off passages that were themselves off larger passages. The site covers approximately 1-3 hectares. Evans counted over 1,300 rooms in the course of his excavations, a figure that subsequent scholars have adjusted and argued over without fundamentally altering its character. The palace in plan has a labyrinthine quality, not because it was designed to confuse, but because it grew and was modified and extended across centuries in response to needs and uses that changed, and the accumulated result is a structure without a governing geometric simplicity. Evans named it the Palace of Minos. He named it this not because any Linear A tablet he found said so. The Linear A script remains undeciphered, which is one of the more quietly remarkable facts about Minoan Crete, that the civilization left records whose content is completely opaque to modern scholarship, but because the site was at Knossos, and Knossos was the seat of Minos in every Greek literary tradition that discussed the subject, Evans brought the myth to the site, and the site gave the myth a physical form. The result is one of the more complex overlaps in Mediterranean archaeology, where a place is simultaneously a ruin that the spade uncovers, a tradition that the texts describe, and an imaginative structure that each generation reconstructs according to what it needs the place to mean. Daedalus would have known the palace's layout. He had been working there for years before the labyrinth was commissioned.
He would have known the storage magazines and the light wells in the corridors that led east toward the sea and the rooms that faced the central court. When he designed the labyrinth, whether as a new construction or a modification of existing spaces, or, as some ancient sources and later scholars have suggested, a structure that used and extended the palace's already complex underground regions, he was working from the inside of a building he understood better than almost anyone else alive. And still, Ovid says, the finished structure nearly lost him. There is something worth pausing on in that detail, something beyond its narrative interest. It implies that the labyrinth had a quality that existed independently of its design, that once the passages were complete and the turning set and the identical-looking junctions multiplied to the number necessary to defeat the plan held in memory, the building began to operate according to its own spatial logic, which was not the same as the logic Daedalus had used to construct it. A maze, once made, knows more about being a maze than its maker does.
The knowledge of how to build the thing and the knowledge of how to move through the thing are different knowledges, and the first does not automatically confer the second. The craft of Daedalus runs through the myth of the Minotaur, the way a structural beam runs through a wall, invisibly but bearing weight.
Daedalus's hands appear at every point where the myth requires something to be made, and what he makes always works precisely as intended and always carries consequences that extend beyond intention. The thing he builds does the thing it was built to do. This is the characteristic irony the tradition builds into his story, the maker who cannot control what the made thing becomes once it is out in the world. After the labyrinth was complete, and after the first tributes had arrived from Athens to be placed within it, Minos moved to confine Daedalus. The Bibliotheca describes the king imprisoning him, not in the labyrinth itself, in most accounts, though some versions of the tradition do place him there imprisoned in the structure he designed, which is the version with the most satisfying internal logic, and keeping him on Crete against his will. The reason was the one that reasons for containing knowledgeable people usually are. Daedalus knew too much. He had built the wooden cow for Pasiphae. He had built the labyrinth for the creature that resulted. He knew the layout of the labyrinth better than anyone alive. He was, in the traditional way of indispensable craftsmen who have been made accessories to the powerful, a liability dressed as an asset. Minos could not allow him to leave. The story of how Daedalus eventually left is the other great story of his time on Crete, the one that does not involve the labyrinth but circles back to the same theme. If Minos controlled the land and the sea, if every harbor was watched and every ship inventoried, then the escape route could not run along the surface of the world. Daedalus made wings of feathers and wax for himself and his son Icarus, and they left Crete by air. The instructions he gave Icarus about the middle course, not too high, not too low, the middle distance from sun and sea, are among the most commented on details in the entire tradition. Icarus went too high. The wax softened and released the feathers, and Icarus fell.
This story runs alongside the labyrinth story as its other half. The craftsman who builds the most earthbound, most enclosed, most gravity-bound structure imaginable, and then escapes it by rising into the air. The labyrinth presses inward and downward. The wings carry outward and upward. Both are made by the same hands. The tradition of Daedalus's workshop life, the daily reality of the craftsman at Knossos, before and after the Great Commissions, is largely lost, which is normal for mythological biography. The ancient writers who preserved these stories were interested in Daedalus, the maker of impossible things, not in the routine of filing and measuring, and the ordinary negotiation of what a patron wants and what the materials will allow. What survives is the concentrated essence, the hollow cow, the labyrinth, the wings, 3 objects that each contained a living being and each shaped the course of the beings they contained. 3 structures in which inhabitation was the point, and the quality of inhabitation, concealment, imprisonment, flight, was built into the material form from the beginning. If Daedalus stands at the center of this myth's architecture, he stands there as a kind of proof that skill and complicity are not opposite categories. He is never described in ancient sources as a willing agent of the Cretan royal family's worst choices. He builds what he is asked to build. He brings his full ability to each commission. The wooden cow is excellently made. The labyrinth is so excellently made that it traps its own builder, and then he is held by the thing he made for the person who commissioned it, and the escape he engineers for himself is as brilliant and as costly as everything else he touches. His son does not survive the flight. He arrives in Sicily alone. The workshops at Knossos, wherever they actually were, have not survived as Daedalus left them. The palace complex shows the evidence of craft production throughout its excavated areas, areas associated with the storage and processing of olive oil and grain, areas where stone vessels were made, the areas that seem to have been used for the working of metal and ivory, but nothing that can be identified specifically as the space where the mythological craftsman worked. The archaeology and the myth share the site without touching at the point that would be most illuminating. What archaeology has found at Knossos is the labyrinthine quality of the building itself, the compressed multi-story arrangement of rooms and corridors and light wells that Evans recognized as the physical substrate of the Greek tradition. What mythology gives back to that archaeology is a name for the quality of the place, and the figure who was said to have given that quality its most extreme and deliberate form. The four labyrinths Pliny lists differ from one another in scale and detail, but they share a structural proposition that a building can be made in which the experience of interior space itself becomes a kind of obstacle, not darkness, not locked doors, not a guard at the entrance, though those features appear across the variants, but the sheer accumulated complexity of passage and return. Pliny's matter-of-fact listing of the four labyrinths alongside one another, the Egyptian beside the Cretan, beside the Lemnian, beside the Italian, suggests that the idea of a building designed to disorient was not considered fantastical in the ancient world. It was considered a category of architecture, ambitious and unusual, but belonging to the continuum of what large-scale building could achieve. The Cretan labyrinth in this listing sits between myth and practice. It belongs to a tradition that is specifically mythological, organized around the figure of Minos and the creature his impiety produced. But it also belongs to a category of real ancient architecture that Pliny treats with practical interest. Whether there was a real structure at Knossos that the later Greek tradition remembered as a labyrinth, whether the sprawling, complex, multi-roomed palace gave rise to the story, or whether the story was attached to an existing site because the site seemed appropriate, is a question that archaeology has not resolved and may not resolve. The linear A tablets, keeping their silence on the matter with perfect consistency. What Daedalus built, in the version the tradition preserved, was not simply a large or complicated building. It was a building that had internalized the principle of confusion so thoroughly that the confusion was a structural feature as primary as the walls themselves. The passages were not incidentally difficult to navigate. They were difficult by design, by the deliberate application of the craftsman's full ability to the specific problem of how to make a space from which departure was impossible without external knowledge. A building as a complete epistemological trap. The person who enters knows where they are at each step, this junction, this passage, this turn, and does not know where they are in relation to the whole, the local and the total refuse to add up. This is the particular quality Ovid is reaching for when he says that the builder himself was nearly lost inside it. Not that the passages were dark, not that they were long, but that the relationship between local position and total position had been engineered out of the building's structure, and knowledge of the design did not restore it. Daedalus would have stood inside it, having finished, having walked through the completed passages to verify the result of his planning. The lamp he carried, and he would have carried a lamp. The deepest sections of any underground structure require one, would have lit the stone of the passage immediately around him, cast shadows at each junction, given the walls a quality of warm and bounded presence, while leaving everything beyond the lamp's reach invisible. 3 passages opening ahead at a junction that looked exactly like the last junction, the sound of his own footsteps, and then, when he stopped, no sound at all. This is not described in those specific terms in any ancient source, but it is implied in Ovid's observation, and it follows from the logical consequence of having built successfully what Daedalus had set out to build. He had made a structure that operated as intended. He stood inside that structure and experienced the operation from the inside. The 3 passages ahead of him would have looked identical, the way the plans showed they were supposed to look identical, and knowing that he had made them to look identical would not have told him which one to take. He would have had to reason his way back to the entrance by some other means, by memory of the route he had taken in, by marking the walls as he went, by some private system of navigation he had prepared in advance precisely because he had known this moment was coming. He had made a building that required preparation to move through, even when the person moving through it was the one who had made it. He found his way out. That is implied by the further history. He was imprisoned afterward on Crete, which means he survived the building he had built and was present to be imprisoned by Minos later. He walked back through those passages and out into the afternoon, or the morning, or whatever quality of light was waiting for him on the other side of the entrance, and the labyrinth closed behind him the way it was designed to close, its passages resuming their identical quality the moment he was no longer standing at their junctions. The materials he had used were stone and timber and rope, the same materials that palace construction used throughout the Minoan world. The tools were the tools laid out on his workbench in the early morning: chisels, mallets, measuring cords. The process had extended over months, possibly years, the construction moving inward from the outer walls, the innermost chambers built last. The creature the innermost chambers were intended to hold had been living in the palace all this time, in whatever arrangement had served before the labyrinth was finished. When the labyrinth was complete, it was ready. The double-headed axe, if the etymology is correct, was present throughout the construction, incised into the stone, pressed into the clay, marking the columns and the thresholds of the rooms. The house of the double axe. The 2 blades of the symbol, each the mirror of the other, neither primary, the central axis between them, the only fixed point. A building organized around the principle of 2 identical options at every junction, neither the right one and neither the wrong one, the act of choosing arbitrary and the consequence the same. The craftsman who made it walked out of it, the lamp in his hand, the marks on the wall he had prepared, the plan held in careful memory, and the building's refusal to confirm that memory from inside, all of this resolving at last into the entrance and the air beyond it. The labyrinth remained. The stone was laid. The passages held their configuration. The junctions multiplied in the dark in their characteristic way, each one identical to the one before it, each one offering the same 3 options that all led back to the same interior. Daedalus had built many things at Knossos, and he would build more afterward, and then he would make wings and leave the island on air, and his son would fall over the sea that now bears the boy's name. But the labyrinth outlasted all of it. It outlasted Daedalus. It outlasted Minos. It outlasted the civilization that had built the palace above it, whose writing no one can now read, and whose religious practice can only be inferred from what the walls, and the storage jars, and the small clay tablets tell us, in the language of objects rather than words. The junction remained. 3 passages going in 3 different directions that looked exactly the same as one another. The lamp out, the walls close on each side, the darkness total, and in its own way complete. In the stone corridors of the labyrinth, far below the palace and the open Cretan sky, sound behaved differently than it did in the world above. A footstep placed carefully on the floor would sometimes carry 30 paces down a straight passage before disappearing. The same footstep in the next passage, which looked identical, would be swallowed almost before it left the foot that made it. Stone absorbed and stone reflected, and the labyrinth had been built in such a way that neither outcome was predictable. The silence between sounds was not the silence of open air. It was thicker than that, and closer, and in its own way complete. Somewhere inside that silence, the tradition holds, a living creature had always been present. The ancient sources do not linger over what the Minotaur's days were like. They are concerned with origins, with the tribute system, with the arrival of Theseus, with the resolution of the myth's political problem. But in the space between those concerns, in the passages of the labyrinth that no ancient author bothers to describe because nothing happened there, the creature that ancient writers called Asterion had always been going about its particular existence, resting, moving, standing at one of the many junctions where several identical passages branched in different directions. The darkness around it was absolute in some chambers and less than absolute in others, where cracks in the stonework above let in threads of light that shifted across the floor as the sun moved. Whether the creature noticed the shifting light, the ancient sources do not say. The word Asterion means starry, or of the stars. It is an unusual name for a creature confined underground, and that unusualness is not accidental. The name was given, the Bibliotheca of Apollodorus records, plainly and without commentary, alongside a description of the creature's form, the bull's head, the human body, the ambiguous blending of 2 kinds of nature into one being. Ancient writers did not always pause to remark on the tension between the luminous name and the subterranean life. They stated both as facts belonging to the same account and moved on. The creature named Asterion, of the stars, lived in the dark below the palace of Knossos, and both of those things were simply true at the same time. In the Metamorphoses, Ovid turns the creature's name over without ever using it, working instead through the body, through the grammar of description. He writes semibove iverum, half-bull man, and then, unsatisfied, writes semivir bovum, half-man bull, placing the words in a different order to see if the second arrangement holds what the first one missed. It does not hold it. The creature refuses both arrangements with equal patience. Ovid's 2 phrases exist as a kind of paired acknowledgement that the Latin language, which could describe most things with considerable precision, could not find a stable slot for Asterion. The bull came first in one sentence, and the man came first in the other, and neither sentence arrived at the truth of the thing being described. Both of them remained, sitting side by side in the poem, neither cancelled out by the other, both of them together closer to the subject than either one alone. The labyrinth that held Asterion was, by the accounts that have survived, a structure built to defeat orientation rather than to restrain through force. Ovid describes it in the 8th book of the Metamorphoses as a place that misled the sense of sight through passages that twisted and obscured, adding the detail that even Daedalus, the Athenian craftsman who designed and built the structure, who understood its geometry from the inside out, was nearly lost within it after the building was complete. This is worth staying with for a moment. The disorienting power of the labyrinth was thorough enough to undo its own architect. a man who had held the plan in his mind through every stage of construction, who had decided where each passage turned and how each corridor connected to the next, stood within the finished building and found that his knowledge of the plan did not protect him from the building's effect. The labyrinth was not simply complicated, it was built at the level at which the human mind makes sense of space, and at that level it deliberately failed. The building's name carries something of this inside it. The word labyrinthos, as the ancient Greeks used it, may derive from labrys, the pre-Greek word for the double-headed axe, a symbol found throughout the palace complex at Knossos, carved into stone column bases and incorporated into the structure's decoration in ways that suggest it carried religious significance for the people who built there. If the derivation holds, the labyrinth was known in antiquity as the House of the Double Axe, a name that describes a place by its presiding symbol rather than by its function, which is a way of naming things that belongs to a tradition considerably older than the Greek myth that eventually settled around it. The double axe is perfectly symmetrical. Both blades are identical. Oriented in either direction, it looks the same. Something in that quality, the symmetry that offers no way to distinguish one side from the other, seems appropriate to a building that was also designed to make every direction feel like every other direction. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era in the 36th book of his natural history, listed the Cretan labyrinth as one of 4 great labyrinths of the ancient world, placing it alongside those of Egypt, Lemnos, and Italy. He treated it with the same tone of careful inquiry he brought to other large architectural facts he could not personally verify, noting a tradition of 100 doorways and an internal arrangement that made navigation without a guide effectively impossible. Pliny was precise about what he could and could not confirm. The Egyptian labyrinth he acknowledged as a real and visitable structure. The Cretan one he described through the tradition rather than through direct observation, which is itself a piece of information. By Pliny's time, if there had ever been a physical structure on Crete that the Greeks identified as the labyrinth, it was no longer available to visit. Whatever it had settled into account and story rather than remaining as stone. The palace complex at Knossos, which the British archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated, beginning in 1900, covered approximately 1.3 hectares and contained at least 1,300 rooms across multiple stories, storerooms and throne rooms, and corridor systems, and light wells and magazines lined with enormous ceramic storage jars called pithoi, which stood taller than a person and held oil and grain and whatever the palace administration needed to keep at hand. Evans described the complex as labyrinthine, and from a plan drawing the word is easy to understand. The overall shape has no clear perimeter, no single organizing axis, no obvious way in or out. Corridors connect to corridors in dense arrangement. Storerooms run in long parallel rows. The light wells interrupt what would otherwise be continuous internal spaces, admitting air and brightness into a structure that would without them have been quite dark. Whether the Greeks, encountering or inheriting memories of such a place, built the myth of the labyrinth from it, or built it from something else entirely, or from nothing physical at all, this is something the archaeology cannot finally answer. But the complex exists, and it is not hard to understand why a mainland Greek encountering it might have concluded that something extraordinary had been deliberately constructed there. The tribute arrangement that the myth describes, 7 young men and 7 young women sent from Athens to Crete at periodic intervals, delivered into the labyrinth, appears in the ancient sources as a political settlement rather than a ritual one, though the line between those categories was not always clear in antiquity. Athens had been unable to defeat Minos at sea. The tribute was the consequence. The ship that carried the youths from the Athenian harbor sailed under black sails, a detail preserved in Plutarch's Life of Theseus and treated there as a sign of mourning that was built into the voyage's form rather than added to it afterward. The black sail was not an expression of grief at a particular departure. It was the permanent condition of that particular ship, making its particular crossing. In the Labyrinth, the ancient sources are careful about the distinction between dying and wandering. The tribute youths were not delivered to the Minotaur. They were delivered into the Labyrinth's passages, where, as Apollodorus and others record, they would wander until they encountered the creature. The wording matters. The Labyrinth did something to them before Asterion did anything. It worked on their sense of direction, on their ability to find a wall and follow it, on their capacity to hold a mental map of where they had been and where they might go. The darkness worked on them. The identical passages worked on them. By the time they encountered the creature at the heart of the structure, they had already been in the building's possession for some time. This framing, the labyrinth as the primary instrument, and the creature as something encountered within it, rather than the thing that begins the encountered, appears across the ancient treatments of the myth with enough consistency to suggest it was a stable part of the story's structure rather than an incidental detail. The building was the prison, and the building was the weapon. Asterion, crouching somewhere in the middle passages, was the thing the building delivered its occupants toward. Whether the creature was understood to wait actively or simply to be present, the sources leave somewhat ambiguous. Both readings produce the same result. The labyrinth moved people toward the center. The center held Asterion, the creature named of the stars, confined in the dark. There is a passage in the second book of Virgil's Aeneid where Aeneas describes the city of Troy on the night of its fall, the Greek soldiers moving through streets they had entered through the hollow horse, killing in the dark. It is not a passage about the Minotaur, but in it, Virgil describes the soldiers moving through the burning city as if through a labyrinth, choosing passages, losing orientation, coming out where they had not intended. The comparison is not stated. It is structural. The labyrinth by Virgil's time had become a way of thinking about the experience of being lost inside a system too large and too deliberately confusing to navigate by ordinary means. It had moved from a specific architectural fact in the Cretan myth into a quality of certain kinds of spaces, cities under siege, bureaucratic systems, any structure that was too complex to hold in the mind and too present to escape. The myth had given the language a word, and the word had begun to do other work. Dante, writing in the early 14th century in the Commedia, placed Asterion not in language, but at a threshold. In the 12th canto of the Inferno, the Minotaur appears as the guardian of the seventh circle of hell, the circle of the violent crouching at the edge of the rocky descent that leads down into it. Virgil and Dante encounter the creature there, and Virgil speaks to it quietly, distracting its attention so that the two poets can pass by in the moment it turns away. The scene is brief. Dante does not linger over the creature's appearance or dwell on what it might be feeling. The Minotaur bites itself in frustration, which is the detail Dante gives, and then the two poets are past it and descending into the circle below. What Dante's placement of the Minotaur represents is the full length of the myth's transmission. The creature that ancient sources placed at the center of a Cretan architectural puzzle, born of the crossing between a Cretan queen and a bull sent by Poseidon, bred from a broken promise and the slow working of divine consequence through a human dynasty. This creature, by the time it reached Dante, had become a guardian of boundaries. It stood at the edge of the violent, which in Dante's moral architecture meant it marked the point at which descent into something more severe became possible. The Minotaur did not represent the violent themselves. It represented the threshold between the human and whatever was below the human. It had been standing at that threshold, in one form or another, since the oldest versions of the story. The myth, at its widest, is made of an unusual number of thresholds. The crossing between the divine and the mortal that produced Pasiphae, the crossing between the human and the animal that produced Asterion, the crossing between the world above ground and the world below it that the Labyrinth represented, the crossing between the free and the imprisoned that was the creature's daily condition. The ancient sources moved through these crossings without commentary, treating them as structural features of the story rather than as problems requiring explanation. In a world where the gods crossed into human lives with some regularity, where the line between the animal and the human was drawn differently than later traditions would draw it, where going underground was a known and documented category of experience, the Minotaur was strange, but it was strange in ways that the tradition had a vocabulary for. The bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos, which date to roughly 1600 to 1450 BCE, show figures in formalized motion over the backs of charging bulls. A figure grips the bull's horns. The bull's body curves in the full extension of its charge, all four legs extended, the spine arched. The leaper, caught mid-vault, extends both arms as the body passes over the animal's back. The figures are painted in the conventions of Minoan art, their proportions elongated, their gestures simplified into clarity, their colors still vivid after more than 3,000 years, the deep red-brown of the bull's coat, the ochre of the ground, the white of the figures' bodies, the dark lines that define the shapes against the pale background. Scholars who have studied these frescoes, following a line of inquiry that Arthur Evans opened at the beginning of the 20th century, and others have continued since, have proposed that the Greek myth of the tribute may preserve a memory of something real and Minoan, not necessarily a Minotaur, not necessarily a labyrinth in the architectural sense, but something involving young people, and bulls, and Crete, and the kind of mortal risk that later generations might have understood as sacrifice. Bull leaping, as the frescoes depicted, was a dangerous practice that required skill and training and involved a real possibility of death. If Minoan Crete trained or employed young people for this ritual, and if some of those young people came from other parts of the Aegean world, then mainland Greeks observing or hearing about the practice might over centuries have transformed it into something their own narrative conventions could contain. The dangerous training ground became the labyrinth, the bull became the Minotaur, the skilled performers became the tribute. This is a scholarly reading, not the myth itself. The myth knows nothing about bull leaping as an explanation for its own existence. The myth holds what it holds, a creature born of a broken vow, confined in a building built to confuse, fed on tribute from a defeated city, its name pointing at the stars from underground. These details fit together into a structure that has persisted for 3 millennia without requiring an explanation outside itself. Whether there was something before the myth that the myth grew from, or whether the myth arrived fully formed from the specific religious and political imagination of archaic Greece, or whether it grew from the combination of Minoan memory and Greek narrative, these questions remain open. The myth does not need them answered to continue being told. The fresco painters of Knossos were not painting mythology. They were painting something from their own world, a practice, a ceremony, a ritual form that had enough significance in Minoan life to appear on the walls of the palace complex. In careful, detailed, vivid work, they painted the bull at full extension because that was what the bull looked like when the leap was happening. They painted the leaper's arms extended because that was what extension looked like in that moment. They were painting from observation or from careful transmission of observed detail, producing images that still carry the quality of things that actually happened in front of someone who then wanted to preserve them. The Greeks who received the myth of the Minotaur were doing something different. They were receiving a story, turning it in the light of their own religious and political world, adding to it, altering it, preserving some elements, and letting others change. By the time Apollodorus compiled his Bibliotheca, likely in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, the myth had already moved through centuries of telling and retelling, had been painted on thousands of vases in workshops across Athens and other cities, had been incorporated into civic narratives that the Athenians used to explain their relationship to Crete and to the hero Theseus, who was the particular champion of Athenian civic mythology. The story was never still. It was always being told by someone in a particular city, in a particular century, for a particular set of reasons that had as much to do with the present as with the past. And yet something persisted through all of it. The creature at the center, the name that means starry, the building designed to prevent departure. These elements appear in source after source, in tradition after tradition, in pottery workshop after pottery workshop, held with the consistency that suggests they were understood as fixed, the unalterable center around which everything else could be rearranged. On the black figure and red figure vases produced in Athenian workshops during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the Minotaur appears most often in the context of the Theseus myth, shown crouching in the labyrinth or engaged in the confrontation that the vase painters rendered with the specific economy of gesture that black figure technique encouraged. The creature's form on these vessels is consistent, a human body with a bull's head, the horns curved in the particular shape that Athenian painters used for bull horns throughout their work on other subjects. The human arms are sometimes raised. The human legs are sometimes positioned to suggest motion or readiness. The bull's head carries no expression that a human face would recognize as readable, and yet the painters gave it a posture, an orientation, a relationship to the space around it that suggests something about the creature's condition in the moment depicted. In the museums where these vessels now rest, in Athens, in London, in New York, in the smaller collections distributed across cities that have been accumulating antiquities for centuries, the Minotaur looks out from the dark glaze of its painted surface with the particular patience of things that have been waiting a very long time. Not alertly, not threateningly. The way things look when they have been in the same position since before any living person can remember, and will be in the same position after any current visitor has gone. Astrion in the Labyrinth had something of this quality in the accounts that paid attention to it. The structure that imprisoned the creature was also, from another angle, simply where the creature lived. The ancient sources occasionally allow this reading. The labyrinth as the Minotaur's home, rather than exclusively its prison, as the place where Asterion had always been and where Asterion would remain. An inverted palace, some readings of the tradition have proposed. The grandeur of Minos's court, above the ground, mirrored below it in a different kind of structure, one that substituted confusion for ceremony, darkness for the painted brightness of the frescoed halls, solitude for the movement of courtiers and administrators and visitors from across the Aegean. Whether Asterion understood its own condition in terms the myth did not bother to describe, whether the creature experienced what the labyrinth imposed on it as prison or as home, or as simply the whole of the world it had ever known, the tradition does not say. The ancient writers were not interested in Asterion's inner life. They were interested in origins and consequences. The creature was the consequence of Minos's broken promise, the visible form of Poseidon's revenge, the mechanism by which the tribute functioned, the obstacle that the hero of the myth would eventually have to overcome. Its experience of the dark corridors and the slow days and the sounds of the palace somewhere above, these were not the story's subject, and yet the name persists. Asterion, not monster, not beast, not the thing below the palace. The name given to the creature by ancient writers is a name that carries light, that refers to a sky full of stars, that was also the name of an earlier Cretan king whose identity had been mostly lost to time. Whether the name was given in irony, or in something older and less explicable than irony, or simply because the tradition that settled on it had reasons the later accounts no longer remembered, there it is, still attached to the creature after 3,000 years, still pointing upward from the dark where the creature lived. Dante did not use the name Asterion. He knew the creature as the Minotaur, which is the Greek compound, the bull Tauros of Minos. By Dante's time, the creature had been the Minotaur for so long that any other name would have required explanation. But the Minotaur that Dante placed at the threshold of the seventh circle was doing something the Greek sources had not explicitly assigned to the creature. It was guarding a boundary, not the boundary of the Labyrinth, which was a boundary between above and below, between outside and inside, between freedom and confinement. Dante's Minotaur guarded the boundary between the human and something the poem identifies as the violent, the bestial, the part of human nature that has abandoned the rational part of its inheritance. The creature, in Dante's placement, had become a symbol of the crossing it had originally embodied, the place where two incompatible natures met in one form. It stood at that threshold in hell as it had always stood in itself, neither fully one thing nor fully the other, the grammar of its description still unstable, still refusing to be settled into a single arrangement of words. This is what 3,000 years of transmission does to a myth. It does not simplify it. The Minotaur is not easier to understand in Dante than it is in Apollodorus. It is differently situated, placed at a new threshold, invested with a new structural meaning, but the core instability that made Ovid try the phrase both ways is still present. The creature is still the thing that language approaches from two sides and finds it cannot enclose. Semibovum virum, semivir bovum. Dante biting its own shoulder in frustration at a boundary in hell. The consistent thread through all the tellings is not what the Minotaur means, but what the Minotaur resists, the settling, the fixing, the single grammatical slot. The bull-leaping fresco in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum on the island of Crete has been in its current location for decades, held in a climate-controlled room where the light is kept low and consistent for the preservation of the pigment. The colors remain: the deep red-brown of the bull's coat, the ochre ground, the pale figures mid-leap. The bull is still at full extension. The leaper's arms are still extended. Nothing in the image is about to resolve into a landing. Nothing is about to become something other than what it is. The leap is happening and will always be happening, fixed by the painter's decision to show it at precisely this moment rather than any other, the moment of maximum extension, the moment when the body has committed entirely to what it is doing and is still in the air. The fresco has been on walls and in rooms for more than 3,000 years. It was on the wall at Knossos when the palace was occupied and functioning, when the storage magazines were full of oil and grain and whatever else the Minoan administrative system needed to account for, when the double-headed axe symbol was being carved into column bases and integrated into the fabric of a living building. It was on the wall at Knossos when the palace was abandoned or destroyed, or whatever it was that ended the Minoan occupation there. The evidence ambiguous, the linear A script still undeciphered, and therefore the reasons still unknown. It was buried for something like 3,000 years before Evans's excavation reached it, and it has been in Heraklion since its recovery, in the cool museum air. The figure's still mid-leap. The myth of the Minotaur was not connected to the fresco when the fresco was painted. The Greeks who built the myth had their own relationship to Minoan Crete, which was not the relationship the Minoans had had to themselves. By the time the myth had settled into the form that Apollodorus compiled, and Ovid reworked, and Dante inherited, the civilization that painted the fresco had been gone for more than 1,000 years, its script unreadable, its religious practices recoverable only through archaeology. The bull that runs through the fresco and the bull that runs through the myth are related to each other, the way two accounts of the same animal are related. They refer to something common. They make the same creature visible through different means, but neither of them is the animal itself. What they share is the quality of persistence. The bull at full charge, the horns forward, the body extended, the legs lifted. This image has been present in the Aegean world, in one form or another, since before the oldest versions of the Greek myth were told. It was on the palace walls. It was on the vases. It was in the name of the creature that lived underground in the dark below Knossos, in the hollow center of the building built to defeat the mind's ability to find its way. The bull-leaping fresco carries it in warm ochre and red-brown on a ground of pale plaster. The black figure vase carries it in the spare, confident lines of an Athenian workshop. Dante's 12th canto carries it in Italian tercerima, the creature biting itself at the threshold of the violent. Ovid carries it in the instability of two Latin phrases that cannot settle the thing they are trying to describe. And in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, in the room kept cool and dim for preservation, the fresco goes about its particular existence with the specific, undemanding patience of something that has been doing exactly this for a very long time. The figures are still mid-leap. The bull is still mid-charge. The ochre ground holds the weight of the image, as it has always held it. The red-brown of the bull's coat is still the color of something that was once alive and moving fast, caught by the painter at the single moment that contained everything essential about what it was doing. The museum is quiet at this hour. The room is cool. The preservation light is low and even, falling across the fresco without heat, without urgency. The bull holds its position at full extension. The leaper holds the moment of the vault, arms out, the body committed entirely to its arc through the air. Nothing in the image is finished. Nothing in the image needs to be